Yeah, you knew this one was coming.
Are you okay?
Well, it was my fate to review Resident Evil 5, where I got the name Boulder Punch from. So with Resident Evil 8 around the corner, I fired it up. I haven't played the game since its release in 2009. I had quite a bit of fun with it at the time. I played the co-op campaign with a friend, although it was a noticeable step down from Resident Evil 4. For this playthrough, I'll be using the companion AI. Plus, I didn't play the DLCs at the time, so these will be fresh experiences for me. Coming back to it all these years later, I still had fun. The game is well designed, but as far as the mainline Resident Evil titles go, it's nothing that really stands out. It wouldn't be until nearly a decade later that numbered titles would return to the survival horror roots. If you enjoyed Resident Evil 4, you'll enjoy Resident Evil 5. While it makes improvements in some areas, the overall package falls short of the masterclass design of Resident Evil 4. So, let's hop to it. Let's see how we got here and what leads up to the moment of Chris punching a boulder inside a volcano. To say Resident Evil 4 was a smash hit and a massive influence that's still felt to this day is an understatement. It has more re-releases than Skyrim. Hell, as of recording, a VR version of Resident Evil 4 was just announced after months of rumors. While there were still elements of horror in Resident Evil 4, it eschewed the survival horror formula to focus more on action, which Resident Evil 5 would continue with. In between the 4 years of Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, we saw the rise of the third-person cover shooter like Gears of War or Uncharted. This was also a time frame in which Japanese studios started to lift more from Western design trends. In some cases, it was farming out their IPs to Western studios, to mixed results. The late 2000s to early 2010s was an odd time for Japanese studios, especially Capcom. "We want the Call of Duty audience," was a common saying amongst the higher-ups at studios. So Resident Evil 5 built on the foundation of Resident Evil 4, but added in more of these Western design trends that emerged in between the two titles. Watching the behind-the-scenes footage for Resident Evil 5 makes this more apparent. The behind-the-scenes footage is all focused on the Hollywood aspects of production. Compare this to other behind-the-scenes footage of other Resident Evil titles which delve more into the game design. There's none of that here. That said, it is really interesting to see all the work they did to get the cutscenes to take shape, especially the motion capture work and seeing the final product. The amount of work they did on this front shows how much they cared about this focus on a more Hollywood feel, and I would say the end product reflects that. Was the game better for it? More on that later. Resident Evil 5 was also the first numbered title to not have any insight from Shinji Mikami. In an interview in 2012, "I didn't play Resident Evil 5 until a year ago, which was long after it came out. They sent me a copy, but I didn't open it for a long time. Whether the game was good or bad, I knew that someone other than me had made it, so it'd be different to my style. I didn't like the idea of that." Unlike Resident Evil 4, which went through numerous iterations of its setting, the setting of Africa for Resident Evil 5 was there since the beginning. The initial trailer shows a Chris that's less on the juice than the final version, which looked to be more survival horror than what we got in the final product. They wanted to try daytime setting as a bit of a technology showcase with their MT framework game engine. They also want to try something different in regards to horror. Granted, you don't see a lot of horror done in the day for good reason, unless you're going for a psychological horror approach, but I give them credits for trying something different. The E3 2007 is much more in line with what we ended up getting, although Sheva was not present and wouldn't be shown until the year after. Before going forward, I can't talk about Resident Evil 5 without the discourse that happened upon its release, the accusation of racism from the press. This was the late 2000s, Twitter was still in its infancy, well before blue check marks were really a thing. There's a lot that can be said about the subject, but let's hear from the actor who played Josh and what he had to say.
It's in Africa. It's been in Antarctica. It's been, I think, in Spain. It's been in the Midwest. It wasn't racist then. Why should it be racist now? It's in Africa. Have fun with the game. Play the game.
In an interview with Karen Dyer, the motion capture and voice actress of Sheva, she had this to say about the subject. "Yeah, it's a bunch of baloney. There was a huge uproar at E3 2007, where it was just the Chris Redfield character in the trailer. At that time, development of Sheva was not even done, and they had started developing that character, and I have all the notes to prove it from early 2007. So by the time I came in September 2007, they still weren't done with how she was going to look. She was still being created, so there was no way of being done by that E3. The whole time I was on set, there was nothing racial, you know? I cannot imagine that if I was being offended that I would have stayed for a whole year, you know? That would have been totally absurd racially. Why would I have stayed? I really can't imagine what kind of response a title like Resident Evil 5 would get today. They would spruce up the diversity in enemies for the final game in comparison to what we saw at E3 2007, including one model who bears a strong resemblance to Saddam Hussein.
Oh my God, that's Saddam Hussein, the dictator!
So with that, let's get to the game proper. I'm playing the Gold Edition on PC. There's an unofficial patch to help you get around Games for Windows Live. Remember that? Ugh. We're playing as Chris Redfield, making his first appearance since Code Veronica. He's on some kind of pharmaceuticals, different than Umbrellas. He's obviously taking the vitamins that Hulk Hogan's always going on about. Or as a certain YouTube fitness legend would say, he's on the Skittles. We meet up with Sheva Alomar, part of the BSAA Western African Division, and she will be accompanying us to look into some black market dealings. Sheva is a great addition to the Resident Evil cast. She's competent, she's likable, she and Chris work well off one another. So, of course, she wouldn't make any other appearances after this title. Come on, Capcom, throw us a bone here. On the note of being competent, her AI has a bit of a mixed reputation over the years. Playing through it, I didn't have any major issues save for a few instances. Granted, I'm guessing the AI did get patched up over time, although I couldn't outright confirm this. In a way, Resident Evil 5 takes some of these co-op aspects of Resident Evil 0 but runs with it. Resident Evil 0 wasn't a co-op game per se, as you could just switch back and forth between Billy and Rebecca, or control the other with a different stick on the controller. But there are areas where we'll need to separate from our partner to move forward. This was also explored in sections with Resident Evil 4 having Ashley with us, although in Resident Evil 5, we have someone who could hold their own in a fight. Right off the bat, I have to commend how great the game still looks. In a way, I think the character models look better in this engine than the RE engine. What do I mean by that? In my RE7 video, I mentioned that the RE engine, as great as it looks with its photorealism, did have some uncanny valley instances. This is especially true with the women when you compare them to the models that they were based after. I will note though that RE8 does look to have addressed this to a certain extent. As well, I did mod the game visuals. What you're seeing on the screen is the difference in filters. I'm playing with the green filter removed. This is something that was quite common at the time. There's very few games I think where a filter made things better. The only one that really jumps to mind is the piss filter in Deus Ex Human Revolution. You have a little intro that helps with the world building and building tension that something is not right in this area. Not only are we a stranger in a faraway land, something isn't sitting right here. Then we get to the game's equivalent of the RE4 village scene. RE5 will have a number of these moments that pull heavy influence from RE4, for better or for worse. The most common enemies throughout the game are the Magini, this game's version of the Ganado. They are infected by a parasite derived from the Plaga parasite of RE4, so they behave more or less in identical manner. The game mixes and matches these types throughout the game. RE4 was a masterclass in pacing on this front. While RE5 doesn't quite hit that mark, it's still very well designed. There's a lot of room to work with here, lots of verticality, and lots of environmental options at our disposal. RE4 did a fantastic job with its combat areas, and RE5 continues in this fashion. Sure, there's a different feeling being in daylight and having a partner with us, but the game will constantly throw you in scenarios that present themselves as major obstacles. While RE4 did eschew a large portion of the looping nature of previous titles, RE5 moves even further away, with only small sections of the game containing some light traces of looping level design before moving on to the next set piece. There's plenty of sections of two paths, with one leading to a dead end with some items before continuing on the main path. Inventory management, the backbone of Resident Evil, has seen another shift. Inventory management is now done in real time. Chris and Sheva have 9 inventory slots each. Each item is the same size, whether an egg or a rocket launcher in our inventory. There are no ways to increase our inventory size. We can swap items back and forth, however.
You grab it. Roger.
Real-time item management does change the flow of the game. Compared to RE4, where to swap weapons or use items, we could do that in the safety of the inventory menu. In a way, real-time management does make up for some of the tension that gets lost, with the increased emphasis on action if you're in a firefight. I focus more on shotguns and machine guns, with Sheva using the rifle on attack mode or pistol in cover mode. I tended to give her healing items when I could. I found she would heal at the right moments for the most part. I'm aware others have said she could be a bit too heal-happy. She will mix herbs if given the option, so if you'd rather not use as many herbs, keep some for yourself. The movement and gameplay that continues from RE4 still feels good all these years later, although it does take some time to readjust to having to stand still while aiming and shooting. The game does expand on melee usage from Resident Evil 4, and if timed right, one melee attack can lead to another by Sheva. As well, you can now stomp down enemies. It's really satisfying to stomp a head to clean off. Speaking of head removals, one thing the game scales back on are the kind of player deaths. Remember how gruesome the RE4 chainsaw death was? Well, they scaled it back here. But also in Mercenaries mode, I did have this death happen. Another thing that they scaled back on is the Q2Es, which is a major sticking point in criticisms for Resident Evil 4. That said, there was a charm to a lot of the QTE deaths in Resident Evil 4, and the game greatly scales back on them, with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about later. For this, I was playing on a keyboard and mouse. Sometimes it was just a simple F button prompt. Other times it would be A plus D key. Other times it would be F plus V prompts, which are kind of an awkward placement. There were a number of times where I was caught flat-footed and took damage as a result. There are some brief mentions and flashbacks mentioning Jill that raise up some questions in our head of what happened with her. There's a lot of Black Hawk Down influences that you can see present in Chapter 1, something which a team used as one of their reference points. The game eschews the save system in prior titles. Instead, the game makes use of checkpoints. Granted, I wish the game didn't mention that we hit a checkpoint, as it makes it really obvious that an enemy encounter is coming up. Well, usually that's the case with the level layout, but I do wish they had that removed. We can upgrade our weapons at the store between missions, but there's no merchant, just a screen. Look, it didn't have to be the merchant coming back, but having some kind of eccentric black arms dealer would have given the game more character. The merchant in RE4 is memorable for good reason. It's nice to see that RE8 is bringing in their own merchant into the fold.
I've been waiting for you, Mr. Winters.
How do you know my name?
Anyone who is anyone has heard of the likes of you.
So we're going after this black arms dealer, Irving. He's the MacGuffin at the beginning of the game to keep the plot moving forward. Sadly, we move on from the village areas fairly quickly. RE5 likes to move on from one set piece to another, and it's too bad because it felt like there could have been more they could have done with these kind of environments. Got a lot more mileage out of them. Chapter 2 mixes up the environments and throws different hurdles in our way, and does introduce more of the Western design trends. There is one portion of the chapter where one of us will carry a lantern, so you can't shoot unless you put the lantern down. It's a good idea in practice that adds some tension, but the cave as it is isn't that dark. It's not like it's pitch black without it. In a way, it reminds me of the older builds of Dark Souls 2. This is where darkness is going to be much more of a challenge, before they change that in the final version. RE5 will have various sections where Chris and Sheva will be separated for a time. I think the game could lean more into this, as some of the better moments in regards to gameplay, tension, and horror pop up in these encounters. The end portion of the chapter will have the turret section, and that's where some of the Western design trends really start to emerge. We have a turret boss fight at the end of the chapter with this game's equivalent of the El Gigante. I have to admit, for a turret-based boss, it's pretty reasonable. Jumping back and forth taking out the big fellow, keeping others at bay that will shoot at us, dodging. It's nothing to write home about, but considering how eye-rolling some turret sections could be, it could have been a lot worse. Moving on to Chapter 3, now we're in the marshlands. One thing I have to note about Resident Evil 5 compared to the other RE titles is that there isn't a noticeable difference in quality between section to section. For example, the island section of RE4 was a drop of what came before. RE7 has quite a drop once we get to the ship section. If anything, I think the middle two chapters, Chapter 3 and 4, are the game at its best. It's fairly consistent across the board and doesn't have any noticeable drops, although nothing hits the highs of the other titles. It's nice that this section has a bit more optional exploration going around in the hovercraft. We get some more insight into the dynamic between Chris and Sheva, why Sheva's fighting, and what happened with Jill. At this point, we can unlock the Lost in Nightmares DLC. Why this wasn't unlocked to begin with, I don't know. I'm a big proponent of letting players access the DLC whenever they want. Perhaps they bought the game years ago on a different account or system and want to jump right into the DLC. Another missed opportunity that RE5 has is not having more talks between Sheva and Chris. There's plenty of moments where moving from area to area in silence, when the game could use that time to flesh out each character. When the game does so, they're enjoyable talks, and they work well off one another. It's another reason why I'm still puzzled Sheva hasn't shown up later in the series. We meet up again with Josh and have some more great combat areas. There's this funny bit here of this conversation about Jill and the emphasis about her being a friend to Chris.
The hard drive containing data on the BOW experiment had a picture inside. The picture was of Chris's friend.
A friend?
Feels like I should be making a joke about something here. Something about, like, a bloodline. I'll come back to me later. I'll finally catch up with Irving and have our boss fight with him. We get a bit more insight about him and the plague doctor wearing individual who's been with him. I wonder who that could be. There's nothing really to say about this boss fight. Most of the boss fights in the game are pretty enjoyable, but I don't think any of them really hit the highs that some did in Resident Evil 4. I know I keep comparing the two back and forth, but there was plenty of times throughout this game where I'd think to myself, you know, I could just be playing RE4 instead.
All your answers await ahead, Chris. In that cave. If you can survive long enough to get them. Italian's not so bad, but it's not gonna change anything. You're still screwed!
We're wasting time here.
Chris!
Moving on to Chapter 4, this chapter feels the most Resident Evil, as far as gameplay goes and story. We're now exploring some underground ruins. There are sections here that will keep each other apart that make for some good tension. There's a section that we avoid fire on the pass that we can also use against our enemies. We very briefly get some portions of looping level design, returning to a point with everything we picked up along the way to move forward. We have a simple puzzle solving section of moving mirrors. It's a nice change of pace to give us some downtime. Too bad the game doesn't really use it to build more of Chris and Sheva's relationship, as we do this in silence. We also get our first appearance of Excella, with an attire looking like J-Lo in an awards show. I also have to note just how drop-dead gorgeous her model and actress is. She's in cahoots with Albert Wesker, and in this new world that he's looking to create, she's ready to help continue that Wesker bloodline.
Oh, I have my eyes set on something much bigger.
At the end of the chapter, we'll get some more insight into how this virus connects with the Resident Evil lore at whole, with mentions of Umbrella. Chapter 5 ramps up the fan service by bringing Lickers back into the fold. This section leading up to their introduction is the game that's most tense and closest the game gets to horror. We have a liquor hallway that's full of tension, although I do think the AI did something here that set them off. There's one part of separation where the liquors come out. It's probably the best tension-filled moment in the game that really nails the feel of Resident Evil 4. I do wish the game had more of these kind of sections, although I can understand why the team didn't put in more. With co-op, they could be much easier to manage, as opposed to having an AI partner. And here we come to one of the oddest parts of the game. We're allowed to take cover because now we're dealing with enemies with guns. They're slow as molasses, so we get plenty of time to get into cover and take them down, as the game wasn't built around it. These parts feel like they were half-assed and tossed in, which I'm guessing they were, as if some higher up said, "We want the Gears of War audience," and tossed it in fairly late into development. Otherwise, this chapter is quite great. Lots of verticality, variety of enemies. Unfortunately, we got to the most annoying boss in the game. There were a couple of times I ran out of ammo just trying to take it down. I did have to go to YouTube to find a way to quickly take it down, and the majority of the comments expressed this frustration as well. It's what Darkside would call a puzzle boss.
I have 4 bullets left. This sucks. This game's fucking stupid. A puzzle boss. Oh, you could completely play it well, dodge everything. Can't beat it though. You need puzzle. It's a puzzle. You need to know exactly when to hit it and how. Fuck off.
Finally catch up with Wesker, and we get the least surprising reveal ever. The Plague Doctor woman is actually Jill Valentine.
The one and only.
She's taken a few style tips from Nina Williams at Tekken, and her experiments led to blonde hair. We have an encounter with them. It's more of a drama-based fight. There's nothing much to say about it. Afterwards, with Jill free from control, we get a nice moment between the three of them as partners.
Chris, you're the only one who can. Before it's too late. Don't you trust your partner?
All right.
care of him. You're our only hope to survive this.
To have Jill be aware of everything that she was doing, even if she could not control it, that's pretty fucked up, although she says she's okay. We won't see her again until the ending, but she'll pop up again in the DLCs. And I'll talk more about Jill's character and role in RE5 later, because there's plenty to discuss there. Moving on to Chapter 6 on the ship, there's plenty of straightforward combat arenas. That said, there's areas of separation, verticality, a lot of enemy variety. We do come across a chase QTE here. This is something the game really scaled back from Resident Evil 4, which I do appreciate. The boss fight here against Super Excel is well made. They are big action set pieces, but they have good design, variety, pacing, and build-up. Leave it to the Japanese to do a better job at what Western studios tend to specialize in. We're reaching the final stretch here in the bulkheads, and it pushes us to the limit. Ton of enemy types in small spaces, but lots of verticality. The stretch at the end here really had me stressing out. Not to the extent of the infamous water room in Resident Evil 4, but pretty close. This may take you a few tries to get through, even on normal, and it's your final lesson prior to the final boss fight with Wesker. Meeting again with Wesker, we got these silly Matrix moves that they ramped up since Code Veronica, and something that future Resident Evil movies would be influenced by, leading to one of Red Letter Media's best moments.
This is borderline experimental.
This makes no sense at all.
On a plane, we get into a QTE battle, and we have some really amusing QTE fails. What was that sound? And the fall itself. Why this one? Because when I see it, all I could think of is DSP.
Your partner died. Dude, that is the best dead scene ever. No!
This section here has some well-known Resident Evil dialogue, some quality meme content.
Ensuring complete global saturation.
And our final fight, we fall into a conveniently placed volcano. Well, I guess if this is going to be Wesker's last stand, might as well make it a big set piece. And yes, there's this moment. The moment responsible for the name of this channel. This one stuck with me for years, one of the most ridiculous moments that just sticks with you in gaming. That said, even when the series went back to a more grounded feel, it's not like they didn't have other ridiculous moments. Fight is pretty simple, and Jill and Josh come by to give us some rocket launchers. So Wesker is deader than dead, and this is the right point to kill him off before he becomes even more powerful and unstoppable. I mean, they could have had him pulling the strings in the background the entire time if they want to, but I think they painted themselves in the corner here with Code Veronica and some of the other work of just how overpowered he could be. This could have worked well for Chris's send-off from the series. He was the one most tied to Wesker and played well off of him. Could have faded into the background here. Of course, that wasn't the case. We fly off into the sunset. Okay, that's not the music that actually plays. So overall, base game of Resident Evil 5, still pretty good. Sure, it moves further away of the core of what Resident Evil was, even more so than what Resident Evil 4 moved away from. That said, it's well paced and well designed, even if it doesn't hit the highs that Resident Evil 4 does. That's the base game. Let's take a look at the DLCs, as this is my first time playing them. Starting with Desperate Escape, this follows what happens to Jill after she and Chris go their separate ways in the main game. Josh comes along and they both make their way out to go help them. Not a whole lot to say about this one. It's more of the extension of Chapter 5 than Chapter 6 of combat-heavy arenas. It's nice to play as Jill again. Short romp, took me about 40 minutes. Again, the areas have nice variety of verticality and enemies to throw at us, concluding with a 5-minute horde mode at the end of fighting enemies off until the chopper arrives. And like any other helicopter pilot in the series, Doug unfortunately meets his untimely demise. Too bad that the time here doesn't really go more into what's happened to Jill, beyond the other two flirting with her, as it's mostly all action. While Desperate Escape was simply an extension of the base game in regards to gameplay, Lost in Nightmares is more of a cross between Resident Evil 4 and the first Resident Evil. This DLC will be with Chris and Jill from the flashback, having us play the raiding of the Spencer estate. If you want an idea of what the original Resident Evil would look like over their shoulder, here it is. Spencer Estate here has design that invokes a lot of the original mansion. I should note that one of the fan projects I discussed in a prior video on Resident Evil fan games is a team creating Resident Evil 1 using the Resident Evil 4 engine. In the meantime, this is the closest we will get. There's some nice callbacks to the first game, including a great moment in a hallway laid out just like the dog hallway in Resident Evil 1. And it plays with that knowledge. It's more of a survival horror feel than what we got with the main game. It's too bad the base game didn't pull more from the survival horror aspect. On the note of Jill, let's talk about her role in the plot of Resident Evil 5. Right off the bat, the game does itself a big disservice by trying to hide that the plague doctor woman is Jill. It's painfully obvious it's her, so why even bother? It's like Arkham Knight. Everyone and their mother thought it would be Jason Todd leading up to it, which the developers denied, and then surprise, it was Jason Todd. Why not have her out in the open to begin with? That could have made for a really interesting dynamic. Chris would be really conflicted, knowing something is wrong with Jill, but maybe having to take down his old partner if she's too far gone. As well, there would be major consequences for the BSAA if one of its founding members seems to have betrayed them. Imagine if they went in this direction and had in the marketing leading up to the game. It's like with Resident Evil 8 with how they've shown Chris shooting Mia.
Sorry, Ethan.
That has sparked plenty of discussion and debate, and I'm super curious to see how that will unfold during Resident Evil 8. And this is the last we see of Jill in the lore of Resident Evil. There is an email in Revelations 2 to Barry where she talks about how she's bored of Tess, but she hasn't appeared since. Reading her in-game files, it's mentioned that when under captive, Wesker used her T-virus antibodies to work on the Ouroboros virus. That's some dark irony right there. To use Jill, someone fighting to stop these BOWs, being used to create BOWs. That's also a great story hook. Jill heads out to deal with BOWs not just to help the world, but to make amends with this knowledge. And really, RE5 feels like a nice end to Chris's story. He found Jill, and he defeated Wesker once and for all. From here, he could have faded more into the background, and Sheva could have stepped up and become a more prominent character in the series. Hell, she and Jill could team up and go deal with bioterrorism. Of course, Capcom would go in a different direction. Chris would keep coming back, while Jill and Sheva didn't. It is what it is, but just odd how they've made that choice since there's much more to move forward with in regards to Jill and Sheva, while Chris's story seems complete. Now that I think about it, with a few shifts here and there, you could have dropped either Jill or Sheva into Chris's role in RE7. Though this is hindsight being 2020 from just one person as opposed to a whole team and stakeholders to deal with. It's just too bad that we've never got to see a solid close to Jill's story, or where Sheva's would go from here. One common criticism about Resident Evil 5 is that it strayed too far away from horror and focused on action. Well, a fan creation went out to create a better solution, the end result being the Night Terror mod. I'll have a link to it in the description. It's not complete, only the first 3 chapters are available, but it's an excellent fan creation of what RE5 could have been if they went in the darker direction. On the note of a darker direction, the game does so literally, setting the game at night along with rain. It evokes more of the atmosphere in the section of the village in RE4 when it's raining. There are more enemies and new enemy types to deal with, along with some changes to the environment to create a more unsettling atmosphere. There's also the addition of save room style rooms. These are safe areas with some music playing to invoke some of those older titles in save rooms. So if you played RE5 a number of times and want something different, or you'd like to see how RE5 would be with a darker approach, check out the Night Terror mod, which I'll have linked in the description. Mercenaries, one of the greatest minigames ever. It was one of the top things I was looking forward to when revisiting Resident Evil 5. I'm so glad to see that they're bringing it back in Resident Evil 8. What is there not to say about Mercenaries at this point? Building up those combos, extending time, dealing with enemies coming from all different directions. It's something I could always return to and kill a few hours with. It's always nice to see the variety of characters that we could play, the weapons they have, and seeing what each of their melee attacks are. If anything, I think this is my favorite version of Mercenaries. There's plenty of variety amongst the characters we could choose, the excellent level design, and the real-time weapon change doesn't break the flow as it would in something like Resident Evil 4. So all in all, RE5 is an enjoyable game. It's well-paced, well-designed, plays well, but falls short of what came before it in Resident Evil 4. 4 years in between these releases saw games take heavy influence from Resident Evil 4. While that title was a trendsetter, RE5 was a trend follower, and there's nothing wrong with that. RE4 was a solid foundation that the series would use for years. And sales-wise, it paid off. Until Monster Hunter World, RE5 was the best-selling title in Capcom's history. Until late 2020, RE5 was the best-selling individual title in the series, being surpassed by RE7 with 7.9 million copies. However, in combined sales, which adds the Gold Edition into the fold, RE5 still remains the best-selling at around 12 million copies, give or take. And yet, when I've looked at polls, RE5 is typically further back amongst favorite titles in the series. While it's still a fun title, I don't go out of my way and recommend it compared to the other titles in the series. People don't seem to be clamoring to replay the game when compared to other titles, and there was plenty of grumbling at the time that the series was losing its way with Resident Evil 5. That strayed even further than RE4 did with the series' roots. Yet, you couldn't argue with sales numbers as a result. It's like that episode of The Simpsons with the flaming Moe. Customers are hounding Moe with cash, while Homer yells at Moe that he just lost himself a customer. And Capcom would continue down this road with Resident Evil 6, push it as far as it could go. And again, like RE5, it sold well, it has its fan base, but it moved even further away from what RE was. But in a rare sign of accurate foresight from a large studio, they scaled things back and returned to the survival horror core of the series with Resident Evil 7. And it paid off, both in fan response and sales. We've seen so many series fade away over the years as a result of short-sighted thinking. And yet, here we are, Resident Evil still stands 25 years later. And while we'll have to wait and see if all this love for Tall Vampire Lady will translate to high sales for RE8, I don't think we should be surprised if Resident Evil 8 becomes another high-selling title in the series.
Well, Ethan Winters. You escaped my little brother's idiot games, did you? Let's see how special you are.
So those are my thoughts on Resident Evil 5. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like, subscribe. If you want to support the channel further, check out my Patreon. Thanks to Tier 3 patrons who are featured in the credits here. You'll get access to videos earlier, my newsletter, be featured in the credits. Alright everyone, hope you enjoyed. Boulder Punch out.